There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when a man finally decides he owns you. It doesn't sound like slamming doors or shattered glass. It sounds like the slow, metallic slide of a deadbolt. It sounds like heavy footsteps on imported hardwood, stopping just inches behind your spine. You tell yourself it's a modern marriage. You tell yourself you still have a choice. But then he looks at you in the mirror and says the words that snap the trap shut. Clara stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her fingers resting lightly on the cold glass. The dress was a weapon. She knew it when she bought it, and she knew it now as it clung to her skin. It wasn't just red, it was the color of arterial blood, a vivid, screaming crimson that demanded the attention of every eye in the room. It had a plunging back, thin silk straps that dug slightly into her shoulders, and a slit that rose dangerously high on her left thigh. In a house built on shadows, silence, and muted grays, the dress was a riot. Tonight was the mayor's charity gala. It was the one night a month Clara was paraded out of the estate, placed on Leo's arm, and expected to smile at politicians who pretended they didn't know where her husband's money came from. Usually she wore black or navy, colors that helped her blend into the upholstery. Not tonight. Tonight, she wanted to be seen. She wanted to remind herself that beneath the heavy, suffocating title of Mrs. Rossi, she still had a pulse. The door to the master suite clicked open. Clara didn't turn around. She watched his reflection in the glass. Leo moved with the quiet, terrifying grace of a man who never had to rush because the world waited for him. He was dressed in his standard uniform, a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, no tie. His collar was unbuttoned, revealing the faint edge of a scar on his collarbone. He paused just inside the doorway. His eyes caught her reflection, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his gaze traveling from the thin silk straps on her shoulders, down the curve of her spine, to the slit at her thigh. It wasn't a look of lust. Clara would have recognized lust. It was the look of an appraiser who had just found a crack in a priceless sculpture. "The car is waiting," Clara said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding her system. She reached for a diamond tennis bracelet on the vanity, struggling for a second with the clasp. Leo walked slowly across the plush rug. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He stopped directly behind her. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and the metallic tang of something cold washed over her. He reached out, his large, calloused hands brushing her fingers aside. He took the bracelet and secured the clasp with a deft, effortless motion. His knuckles brushed the skin of her wrist. Clara suppressed a shiver. "It's a beautiful bracelet," Leo said quietly. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like gravel under tires. "Shame it doesn't match the dress." "It matches perfectly," Clara replied, keeping her eyes fixed on his reflection. "No." Leo's hands moved from her wrist, tracing slowly up her bare arm, over her shoulder, until his fingers grazed the bare skin of her back. "The dress is too loud, Clara. It screams." "Maybe I want to scream, Leo." His hand stopped. His fingers pressed lightly into the space between her shoulder blades. A warning pressure. Screaming draws crowds. Crowds draw problems. We don't do problems. It's a charity gala. The entire point is to draw a crowd. Clara finally turned to face him. Up close, the height difference was daunting. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. They were a flat, unreadable brown. Dark, bottomless. I'm wearing it. Leo looked down at her. A muscle in his jaw feathered. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. No, he said, his tone conversational. You're not. You don't get to dress me, Leo. I'm your wife, not one of your soldiers. My soldiers follow orders, he murmured, taking a half step closer, forcing Clara to press her back against the edge of the vanity. My wife is supposed to have better sense. I'm wearing the dress, she repeated, her pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She grabbed her clutch from the counter. If you don't want to be seen with me, I'll take my own car. Leo moved faster than her eyes could track. His hand snapped out, wrapping around her wrist. Not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to paralyze. He took the clutch from her fingers and tossed it onto the bed. Listen to me very carefully, Leo said, leaning in until his lips were inches from her ear. That dress isn't leaving this house. He paused, his breath warm against her skin. And neither are you. Clara froze. The defiance in her chest hit a wall of absolute reality. This wasn't a negotiation. You're locking me in? She whispered, the absurdity and horror of the situation warring in her throat. Over a piece of silk? I'm keeping you safe, Leo corrected smoothly. He released her wrist and stepped back, straightening his cuffs. Take it off, Clara. Wash your face. Go to bed. And if I don't? Leo paused at the door. He looked back at her, his expression utterly blank. Then I suppose you'll have a very uncomfortable night sleeping in silk. Good night, Clara. The door clicked shut. A second later, Clara heard the heavy, definitive sound of the electronic deadbolt sliding into place. The security system chimed softly. She was locked in. Clara stood in the dead center of the massive room, the crimson dress suddenly feeling heavy, like a shroud. She looked at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked fierce, bold, and entirely trapped. She reached around, unzipped the dress, and let it pool like blood on the floor. No one tells you that signing your life away usually happens on a Tuesday morning over lukewarm coffee. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was 2 a.m. Leo hadn't returned. Her mind drifted back to the day the cage was built. 3 years ago. Her father's shipping company had been hemorrhaging money. To keep it afloat, he had borrowed from people who didn't deal in grace periods. When the debt came due, her father had nothing but a sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate and a 24-year-old daughter. Leo Rossi had walked into their dining room, flanked by 2 men who looked like they chewed glass for breakfast. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't threatened. He simply laid a leather folder on the table. Inside were the deeds to her father's properties, the ledgers of his debts, and a marriage license. Blank, save for Leo's signature at the bottom. I need a wife with a clean name to legitimize certain avenues of my business, Leo had said, stirring his espresso. You need your father to keep his kneecaps. It's a clean trade. Clara had signed it. She hadn't cried. She had calculated the odds, realized she had no cards to play, and picked up the pen. She thought she was entering a partnership of convenience, a cold war of mutual benefit. She hadn't realized that to a man like Leo, you weren't a partner, you were an asset. And Leo Rossi protected his assets with a suffocating, paranoid intensity. Morning broke gray and sullen. The electronic lock on the bedroom door disengaged with a quiet beep at exactly 7 a.m. Clara rose, her limbs stiff. She showered, dressed in a muted cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, back to the uniform, and walked downstairs. The house was a fortress disguised as architectural brilliance. Floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass, steel beams, concrete minimalism. It was beautiful in the way a scalpel is beautiful. Everywhere she went, the silent eyes of the security cameras tracked her movements. She found Leo in the dining room. He was sitting at the head of the long oak table, reading a tablet, a cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. He looked exactly as he had the night before, unbothered, untouchable. Clara pulled out a chair at the opposite end of the table, maximizing the distance between them. A maid quietly poured her coffee and vanished. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the scrape of Leo's finger on the glass screen and the gentle clink of Clara's spoon against her porcelain cup. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the scalding coffee at his immaculate shirt. Instead, she took a slow sip. "Did you enjoy the gala?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the anger that was currently chewing a hole in her stomach. Leo didn't look up from his tablet. "It was adequately tedious. The mayor sends his regards. I told him you were fighting a migraine." "A migraine," Clara repeated. "Is that what we're calling it?" Leo finally locked the tablet and set it face down on the table. He looked at her, his dark eyes analyzing her posture, her tone, the tight set of her jaw. "We're calling it what it was, a necessity. Locking your wife in her room because you didn't like her dress is a necessity. What century do you think you're living in, Leo?" "I live in the century that requires me to stay alive, Clara," he said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "And to keep you alive, that dress was a beacon. It was a neon sign in a room full of predators." "You're the biggest predator in the room," Clara snapped, her composure cracking. She slapped her palm against the table. The silverware rattled. "I am not one of your shipments, Leo. You don't get to lock me in a vault when you feel like it. I have a life, or at least I'm supposed to." Leo stood up. The scraping of his chair against the floor sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He walked slowly down the length of the table. Clara forced herself not to shrink back in her chair. She held her ground, lifting her chin. He stopped beside her. He reached out, and for a split second, Clara thought he was going to grab her throat. Instead, his fingers gently traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. His touch was paradoxically tender, completely at odds with the coldness in his eyes. "You have a life because I give you one," Leo said softly. "The people I deal with, Clara, they don't look at you and see a woman. They look at you and see a lever, a way to move me. You want to wear a red dress and play the defiant wife? Fine, but you do it here, where I can see you, where I can keep the wolves off your back." He dropped his hand and turned away. "Dominic is coming over this afternoon. Stay out of the West Wing." He walked out of the room, leaving Clara sitting in the chilled air, her cheek still burning from the ghost of his touch. She stared at her coffee. It wasn't about the dress. It was never about the dress. It was about control. And Clara realized, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that she was losing whatever small fraction of it she had left. Dominic arrived at 1 p.m. Clara watched from the second-floor landing as Leo's second-in-command stepped through the front doors. Dominic was a stark contrast to Leo. Where Leo was precision and cold calculation, Dominic was blunt force. He walked with a heavy limp, a souvenir from a territory dispute 5 years ago, and wore his aggression like cheap cologne. He didn't come alone. 2 enforcers followed him inside, their suit jackets bulging slightly at the hips. The atmosphere in the house shifted immediately. The sterile, quiet air grew thick with tension. Leo met them in the foyer. There were no handshakes, no pleasantries. "Library," Leo said. It was a command, not a suggestion. The men moved toward the west wing. Clara knew she was supposed to go back to her room, read a book, and pretend she was deaf to the reality of her husband's world. That was the unwritten rule of their marriage. She ignored the blood, and he ensured she never had to see it. But today, the defiance that had started with the crimson dress was still burning in her chest. She didn't retreat. Clara moved silently down the hallway, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the hardwood. She bypassed the main corridor and slipped into the billiard room, which shared a heavy, oak-paneled wall with Leo's library. There was an old ventilation grate near the floorboards. She had discovered it months ago. If you knelt close enough, the voices from the library filtered through, distorted but legible. She knelt on the rug and pressed her ear near the grate. Mess, Leo," Dominic was saying, his voice rough and breathless, like he'd been running. "Absolute bloody mess. If we had been 10 minutes later, they would have caught us at the loading dock." "Casualties?" Leo's voice. Calm, measured, ice over deep water. 2. Marcus and the new kid, Rossi. They didn't make it. The Irish knew the route, Leo. They knew the goddamn route. Someone sold us out. Clara held her breath. The Irish. The O'Connor Syndicate. They had been trying to edge into Leo's territory for months, but it was usually small skirmishes. Turf wars at the docks. Nothing like this. "Are you sure it was O'Connor?" Leo asked. "Positive," Dominic spat. "And that's not the worst of it. We grabbed one of their scouts before he could rabbit, tossed him in the warehouse, and had a little chat. He spilled before I even had to break his fingers." A heavy pause. The sound of liquid being poured into a glass. "Spit it out, Dom," Leo said. The hit at the docks was a distraction, a secondary objective. Dominic hesitated, a rare occurrence for him. The primary was the gala last night, the mayor's charity dinner. Clara's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Explain," Leo said. The temperature in his voice had plummeted. "They had a team waiting in the catering staff," Dominic said. "They knew you were going to be there, but they weren't going for you, Leo. They knew your security detail is too tight. They were going for your wife. The order was to grab her in the chaos, throw her in a service van, and use her to leverage the South Side ports." Clara fell back against the wall, her hand flying to her mouth to muffle a gasp. That dress isn't leaving this house. He had known, or at the very least, he had suspected. He hadn't locked her in the room because the dress was too revealing. He hadn't done it out of petty, fragile male jealousy. He had looked at her, standing there in bright red, a literal walking target in a room full of potential shooters, and he had locked her in a vault to keep her alive. "I see," Leo said through the grate. "If you had brought her last night, Leo..." Dominic trailed off. "Christ, we got lucky." "Luck has nothing to do with it," Leo replied, his tone sharp. "I kept her home, clean up the mess at the docks, find the leak in our crew. No one sleeps until I have a name." Clara didn't wait to hear the rest. She scrambled up from the floor and walked quickly back to the main house. Her mind was a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions, fear, realization, and a sudden, sharp clarity. She walked into the kitchen and gripped the edge of the marble island, trying to steady her breathing. He saved her life. But he had done it like a dictator. He hadn't warned her. He hadn't trusted her enough to explain the danger. He had simply stripped her of her agency, locked the door, and gone to war while she sat in her room, hating him for a completely different reason. The anger didn't dissipate. It mutated. It evolved from the frustration of a neglected wife into the cold, hard resentment of a prisoner realizing the true strength of her cage. 10 minutes later, the kitchen door swung open. Leo walked in. He looked tired. It was a subtle thing, a slight tension around his eyes, a tightness in his shoulders, but Clara had spent 3 years studying him like a textbook. He stopped when he saw her standing by the island. He walked over to the espresso machine, his back to her. "Dominic is gone," Leo said quietly. "I know," Clara said. Leo turned around, leaning against the counter. He looked at her, really looked at her. "Are you still angry about last night?" Clara looked right back. She thought about screaming. She thought about throwing a glass. Instead, she straightened her spine, pulling every ounce of dignity she possessed around her like armor. "They were going to take me at the gala," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Leo went completely still. The silence stretched between them, thick as wet cement. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't deny it. He never bothered with lies when the truth was already bleeding out. "You listened at the grate," he stated flatly. "You let me hate you," Clara countered, stepping forward. "You let me stand there, humiliated, thinking you were just a jealous, controlling bastard, when all you had to do was say, 'Clara, there's a threat.' All you had to do was talk to me like a human being instead of a piece of property." "If I had told you," Leo said, his voice lowering, "you would have panicked. You would have asked questions I didn't have the answers to. You would have been afraid." "I am afraid, Leo," Clara yelled, finally letting the volume match the chaos inside her. "I've been afraid since the day you bought me from my father. But I am not a child. I am your wife." Leo closed the distance between them in two long strides. He grabbed her by the upper arms, his grip tight, his face inches from hers. The mask of indifference was gone. For the first time, Clara saw the raw, violent current that ran beneath his surface. "You want the truth?" Leo growled, his breath hot against her face. "You want me to treat you like my equal in this world? Fine. The truth is, my enemies look for my weak point, and they found it. You." He gave her a slight shake, his eyes burning into hers. "You think I locked you up because of a dress? I locked you up because the thought of someone putting a hand on you makes me want to burn this entire city to the ground. You are my wife, and in my world, that means you are a target. I don't have the luxury of explaining things to you gently. I only have the mandate to keep you breathing." He let go of her abruptly, stepping back as if he had burned his hands. He dragged a hand through his dark hair, chest heaving slightly. Clara stood there, her arms tingling where he had gripped her. Her heart was beating so fast it physically hurt. He had just admitted his vulnerability. In the twisted, violent language of Leo Rossi, he had just confessed that he cared. But Clara wasn't the naive 24-year-old who had signed a paper to save her father anymore. She looked at the man who owned her, the man who had just saved her, and felt something cold and hard settle in the pit of her stomach. "If I'm a target," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the silence like a knife, "then stop putting me behind glass, Leo. Give me a gun." Leo froze. He looked at her, the shock barely registering on his face before it morphed into something else. Something dangerous. Something that looked terribly, terrifyingly like pride. The fracture had begun. A gun does not feel empowering. Not at first. Hollywood lies about the weight of it. When Leo handed Clara the matte black Glock 19 in the subterranean shooting range beneath the estate, her wrist immediately dropped an inch. It was a heavy, ugly, utilitarian block of steel and polymer. It smelled of CLP oil, burnt carbon, and malice. "Keep your finger off the trigger," Leo said. His voice was muffled through the heavy electronic earmuffs he had placed over her head, but the command was sharp. "Until you are ready to destroy whatever is in front of you, your index finger rests on the frame." They were 50 feet underground. The air down here was dry and reeked of copper. Clara looked down at her hands. Her manicured nails, painted a soft, neutral beige, looked absurd against the grooved grip of the weapon. "I thought you'd give me a pearl-handled revolver," Clara said, staring at the paper target 30 feet away. It was a blank silhouette. No face, just a center of mass. "Revolvers have heavy trigger pulls and low capacity," Leo replied, stepping behind her. "And pearl handles are for men who care more about their image than their survival." Stance. He tapped the back of her left knee with the toe of his Oxford shoe. "Feet shoulder width apart. Lean forward. If you stand straight up, the recoil will knock you on your ass." Clara adjusted her footing. She felt ridiculous. She felt terrifyingly awake. Leo's hands covered hers. He didn't offer a gentle, romantic embrace. This wasn't a movie where the handsome instructor leaned in to whisper sweet nothings. His grip was rigid, forcing her palms to lock together around the gun. He adjusted the angle of her wrists with a ruthless efficiency that made her joints ache. Right hand high on the backstrap, left hand wraps around the fingers of the right, thumbs point forward, Leo instructed. He stepped back. "Align the front sight between the rear sights. Put the front post center mass." Clara squeezed one eye shut. "Keep both eyes open," Leo barked. "Closing an eye cuts your peripheral vision in half. In a real fight, the thing that kills you is usually the thing you didn't see coming." Clara forced her left eye open. The sights blurred slightly, then snapped into focus against the paper chest of the silhouette. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Press the trigger," Leo said. "Don't jerk it. Press it steadily until it surprises you." Clara moved her finger inside the trigger guard. She took a breath, held it, and pulled. The explosion was deafening, even through the earmuffs. The recoil snapped her hands violently upward. A spark of brass ejected past her right cheek. She let out an involuntary gasp, taking a stumbling step backward. Leo was there, a solid wall of muscle, catching her shoulder before she could lose her balance entirely. "Muzzle down range," he snapped, grabbing her wrist and forcing the barrel back toward the paper silhouette. "Never turn with a loaded weapon. Never." Clara stood panting, the adrenaline hitting her bloodstream like a physical blow. She looked at the target. There was a ragged hole in the white paper, 2 inches above the left shoulder. "You anticipated the recoil," Leo said, his voice returning to its normal, measured cadence. He stepped away from her, his hands clasped behind his back. You pushed the gun down right before it fired, and you pulled to the left. Try again. For the next 2 hours, the basement echoed with gunfire. Clara's shoulders ached. The webbing between her thumb and index finger began to chafe and blister from the friction of the grip. But she didn't ask to stop. She was angry. She channeled every ounce of frustration, every moment of feeling like a pawn in her father's debts, every second spent trapped in her bedroom the night before, straight down the barrel of the gun. Bang. Target center. Bang. 2 inches left. Bang. Center again. Leo didn't praise her. He corrected. He adjusted her footing. He reloaded her magazines in silence. But the air between them had shifted. The sterile, impenetrable wall he had built between his business and his wife was cracking. When the slide locked back on her final empty magazine, Clara lowered the weapon. Her arms were trembling with fatigue. She pressed the magazine release, letting the empty metal casing drop to the concrete floor, and set the gun on the wooden bench. She pulled off her earmuffs. The silence in the range rang in her ears. Leo walked over and picked up the target controller, bringing the paper silhouette down the track toward them. The center mass was shredded. It wasn't precision shooting, but it was lethal. "If someone comes for you," Leo said, looking at the target, "and you freeze, this means nothing." "I won't freeze," Clara said, rubbing her raw thumbs. Leo finally looked at her. His dark eyes dragged over her flushed face, her disheveled hair, the sweat dampening the collar of her shirt. "Violence isn't about skill, Clara. It's about a willingness to destroy another human being before they destroy you." He stepped closer, the smell of gunpowder clinging to his expensive suit. "Are you willing?" Clara looked up at him. She thought about the men in the catering van. She thought about being thrown into a trunk, used as a bargaining chip, stripped of whatever dignity she had left. "I'm willing to survive," she said evenly. Leo stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then very slowly, he nodded. "Good," he murmured, "because I just found out who gave the Irish our shipping routes. Betrayal in this world didn't wear a mask. It usually wore the face of someone who poured your coffee or asked about your day. His name was Thomas. He was a driver, a quiet man in his late 40s who had been with Leo's organization for 6 years. He had driven Clara to her dental appointments. He had carried her shopping bags. Now, he was kneeling on the drop cloth covering the hardwood floor of the estate's unfinished east wing. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The air in the room was freezing. The heating hadn't been installed in this section of the house yet, leaving the exposed drywall and concrete floors feeling like a tomb. Leo hadn't told her to stay in her room this time. When Dominic called to say they had the mole, Leo had simply looked at Clara and said, "You want to be part of the reality? Come." It was a test. She knew it. He was pushing her to the edge of the cliff to see if she would close her eyes and step back into the safety of her gilded cage. She didn't close her eyes. Thomas was weeping. It was a pathetic, gasping sound that echoed off the bare walls. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, his face bruised and swollen from wherever Dominic had interrogated him. Dominic stood a few feet away, leaning casually against a steel support beam, tossing a heavy brass lighter from hand to hand. "I didn't have a choice, Mr. Rossi," Thomas sobbed, his bloodshot eyes darting wildly toward Leo. "O'Connor's men, they found my brother. He owed them money from the tables. They said they would gut him. I just gave them the dock schedule. That's all. Just the schedule." And the layout of the charity gala? Leo asked. He was standing directly in front of Thomas. He wasn't yelling. He was speaking with the calm, detached tone of an auditor reviewing a spreadsheet. Thomas choked, a fresh wave of tears spilling over his bruised cheeks. They swore they were just going to rob the lockbox. They swore they wouldn't touch Mrs. Rossi. But they were going to, Leo said softly. Please, boss, please. Thomas looked toward the doorway, his eyes locking onto Clara. Mrs. Rossi, Clara, please, tell him I have a daughter, please. Clara's stomach convulsed. The bile rose in the back of her throat. This was the man who had asked about her favorite podcasts on the drive to the city. This was the man who had bought her a cheap plastic umbrella when it rained unexpectedly outside a boutique. She looked at Leo. Leo was watching her. He didn't prompt her. He didn't intervene. He was giving her the floor. He was waiting to see what the woman who demanded a gun would do when faced with the trigger. The silence in the room was absolute, save for Thomas's ragged breathing. Clara looked back at the kneeling man. Pity tore at her chest, raw and aching. She wanted to scream at Leo to let him go. She wanted to say it wasn't his fault, that he was desperate, that blood mattered more than loyalty to a crime syndicate. But then she remembered the conversation in the library. They were going to grab her in the chaos, throw her in a service van. If Thomas had succeeded, she wouldn't be standing here. She would be chained in a basement or dead. Thomas had weighed her life against his brother's, and he had made his choice. This was the rot inside Leo's world. If you showed mercy to a man who sold you out, you didn't just forgive him. You sent a broadcast to every other desperate man in the crew that your wife was an acceptable price to pay for their own debts. Clara lowered her arms. She stood perfectly straight, smoothing the front of her dark wool trousers. She looked Thomas directly in the eyes, burying her empathy under a layer of ice she didn't know she possessed. You made a trade, Thomas, Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. I'm sorry it was a bad one. She didn't look at Leo. She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her footsteps sharp against the concrete. She was halfway down the main corridor when she heard the single, muffled pop of a suppressed gunshot. Clara stopped. She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cold glass of the hallway window. She didn't cry. She just breathed, feeling the heavy, irreversible shift in her soul. She was no longer a civilian playing dress-up in a mafia king's house. She was complicit. 5 minutes later, Leo walked down the hall. He stopped beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, looking out the window at the sprawling manicured lawns of the estate. Dominic will clean it up, Leo said, quietly. I know, Clara replied. You didn't flinch. I flinched on the inside, she admitted, her voice hollow. I just didn't let him see it. Leo finally turned his head to look at her. The cold, unreadable mask he usually wore was entirely gone. He looked at her with a heavy, dangerous respect. O'Connor knows Thomas didn't report back, Leo said, shifting the conversation back to the tactical reality. They know we found the leak, which means the quiet phase of this war is over. What happens now? Now, Leo said, his jaw tightening. We invite Declan O'Connor to dinner. The war didn't announce itself with sirens. It announced itself with a hand-delivered envelope. It arrived the morning after Thomas's execution. A thick, cream-colored envelope left at the front gate. Inside was a single card, written in elegant calligraphy. To Leo and Clara Rossi, the docks are crowded. It is time we discussed a mutual separation of interests. Join me for dinner at the Cardinal Room tonight. Neutral ground. No weapons. Let us talk like businessmen. Declan O'Connor. Leo tossed the card onto the granite kitchen island. Dominic, who was nursing a black coffee and a bruised ego from the security breach, scoffed. Neutral ground my ass, Dominic growled. The Cardinal Room is owned by the neutral families, sure, but O'Connor has been greasing the maitre d' for a year. It's a setup. He wants you out of the house, Leo. Of course it's a setup, Leo agreed smoothly. He knows I won't hand over the ports. He expects me to decline the invitation and lock down the estate, which makes us look weak to the other families. He's forcing a public play. Clara sat on one of the bar stools, watching the two men. So, you go to the dinner. You show him you aren't afraid. No, Leo said, his eyes snapping to hers. We go to the dinner. Dominic nearly choked on his coffee. Leo, you can't be serious. You bring the wife into a hot zone? Thomas just tried to hand her over to these animals. If bullets start flying, she's safer next to me than she is here, Leo cut in, his voice brooking no argument. The estate is compromised. Thomas proved that. Until I purge the rest of the staff, I can't guarantee who is on O'Connor's payroll. Furthermore, the invitation was addressed to both of us. If she stays behind, O'Connor controls the narrative. He tells the city I'm too terrified to let my wife leave her cage. Clara felt a strange, thrilling spike of adrenaline. He was weaponizing her presence. Dominic, Leo commanded. Get the armored cars ready. Standard detail, but keep them invisible. I want 4 men inside the restaurant, seated before we arrive. And get me the blueprints for the kitchen exits. Dominic looked like he wanted to argue, but one glance at Leo's face shut him down. He nodded curtly and left the kitchen. Leo turned to Clara. We leave at 8. No weapons? She asked, raising an eyebrow at the card. Leo smirked. It was a dark, lethal expression. I never go anywhere without a weapon, Clara. Go get dressed. Wear something. He paused, his eyes sweeping over her. Distracting. At 7:45 p.m., Clara walked down the grand staircase. She hadn't chosen red this time. She chose emerald green. The dress was silk, clinging to her ribs and hips like a second skin, falling to the floor in a liquid pool of fabric. It had long sleeves and a high neckline, projecting absolute, untouchable elegance. But the back was completely cut out, and the side slit was unforgiving. It wasn't a dress meant to blend in. It was a dress meant to hold the attention of every man in a room, so they wouldn't notice the movements of her husband. Leo was waiting in the foyer. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo, tailored flawlessly to hide the bulk of the shoulder holster Clara knew he was wearing. He looked up as she descended the final steps. For a second, the Mafia boss disappeared. He was just a man looking at a beautiful woman. He swallowed hard, his throat working, before he quickly reassembled his mask of indifference. You look, Leo started, clearing his throat. Acceptable. Don't overwhelm me with compliments, Leo. I might swoon, Clara said dryly, picking up a black velvet clutch from the entry table. Turn around, he said. Clara sighed, but complied, presenting her bare back to him. She felt his hands on her waist. The heat of his palms bled through the thin silk. She caught her breath, expecting him to complain about the dress again. Instead, She felt the cold, heavy weight of steel being pressed against her right thigh, beneath the slit of the dress. Leo knelt behind her. He strapped a black, elastic tactical garter around her thigh, right where the slit of the dress provided immediate access. He took a small, subcompact Sig Sauer P365 from his pocket and slid it into the holster. "Condition 1, Leo murmured, his breath brushing the back of her knee. "Round in the chamber, no external safety, point and pull." He stood up, his hands lingering on her hips for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before stepping back. "If things go wrong tonight," Leo said, his voice deadly serious, "you don't look for me. You don't wait for Dominic. You draw that weapon, you find the nearest exit, and you shoot anyone who tries to stop you. Do you understand?" Clara looked down at her leg. The gun was entirely hidden when she stood still, but the moment she moved, it was there, a lethal secret beneath emerald silk. "I understand," she said. Leo stepped closer. He reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His thumb grazed her cheek, and this time Clara didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement of the terrifying partnership they had just forged. "O'Connor thinks he's inviting a hostage to dinner," Leo whispered, his dark eyes burning into hers. "Let's show him he invited a loaded gun," Clara smiled. It was a cold, sharp thing. "Let's go," she said. The heavy oak doors of the estate opened, and for the first time in 3 years, Clara Rossi walked out into the night not as a prisoner, but as a predator. The Cardinal room smelled of roasted bone marrow, aged scotch, and old money. It was the kind of establishment that didn't put prices on the menu, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford a seat at the table. Heavy velvet drapes muted the sirens of the city outside. A jazz trio played in the corner, the upright bass thumping a slow, steady rhythm that matched the pulse in Clara's throat. When Leo and Clara stepped through the mahogany doors, the effect was immediate. The low hum of conversation didn't stop entirely. These people were too well bred to stare openly, but the pitch dropped. Eyes flicked over the rims of crystal wine glasses. Clara felt the weight of their collective gaze. The emerald silk shifted against her skin. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her hand resting lightly in the crook of Leo's arm. Beneath the fabric, the cold steel of the Sig Sauer pressed into her thigh, a grounding anchor in a room full of sharks. Leo was a ghost in midnight blue. He moved with an unhurried confidence that radiated absolute authority. He didn't scan the room like a nervous bodyguard. He didn't have to. Dominic's men were already seated, 2 at the bar, nursing dirty martinis, 2 in a corner booth, pretending to argue over a spreadsheet. "Table for Rossi," Leo said to the maitre d'. The man was sweating. It was a microscopic detail, a slight sheen on his forehead, and a tightness around his mouth. But Clara caught it. He swallowed hard before forcing a smile. "Right this way, Mr. Rossi. Mr. O'Connor is waiting for you in the private alcove." They were led to a raised platform at the back of the restaurant, separated from the main floor by frosted glass partitions. Declan O'Connor was sitting at a round table, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a retired college professor. He had thinning silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and wore a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches. He looked harmless. Clara knew better. Harmless men didn't order hits on charity galas. "Leo," Declan said, his voice a warm, rolling baritone. He didn't stand up. "Thank you for coming. and Mrs. Rossi. A vision, truly. I apologize for the abrupt invitation, but these matters require a certain immediacy. Declan, Leo replied flatly. He pulled out a chair for Clara, waiting until she was seated before taking the chair to her right. He didn't offer to shake hands. "Can I pour you a drink?" Declan asked, gesturing to the bottle of Macallan on the table. "We won't be staying long enough for a drink," Leo said. He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his jacket with a smooth, practiced motion that freed his right arm for a clean draw. "You wanted to talk about a separation of interests. Talk." Declan sighed, a disappointed sound, and took a sip of his scotch. "You young men are always in such a rush. You lack an appreciation for the theater of it all." "Very well. The ports, Leo, the southern docks. Your operation there is choking my supply lines. I need them. I'm willing to buy you out at a premium, of course. We aren't savages. The southern docks belong to my family," Leo said softly. "They have for 3 generations. They aren't for sale, not for a premium, not for your entire organization. Times change, Leo. Stubbornness is a terrible business model." Declan shifted his gaze to Clara. It wasn't the appreciative look of an older man admiring a beautiful woman. It was the clinical assessment of a butcher evaluating a cut of meat. And a man with a beautiful wife, he has so much to lose. So many vulnerabilities that require attention. Clara didn't blink. She reached for the water glass in front of her, her hand perfectly steady. She took a sip, set it down, and smiled. It was a terrifying smile, utterly devoid of warmth. "My husband is very attentive, Mr. O'Connor," Clara said. Her voice was smooth, cutting through the heavy tension like a razor blade. "He makes sure everything he owns is thoroughly protected. I wouldn't worry about his vulnerabilities. I would worry about overextending your reach." Declan's eyebrows rose. He looked back at Leo, a genuine spark of amusement in his eyes. "Spirited. I heard she was just a shipping magnate's collateral. You didn't tell me you married a viper, Leo." "I married my equal," Leo said. He didn't look at Clara, but she felt the shift in his posture. A coiled spring, ready to snap. Clara looked past Declan's shoulder. 2 waiters were approaching the table. They were carrying silver trays with domed lids, but their eyes were fixed dead on Leo, and they were wearing thick, rubber-soled tactical boots. Waiters in fine dining wore polished dress shoes. Clara's right hand slipped off the table, dropping into her lap. Her fingers brushed the cold silk of her dress, finding the slit. "The problem with equals," Declan said, setting his glass down with a heavy thud, "is that they die just the same." Declan nodded at the approaching waiters. The jazz music didn't stop, but the world did. Violence doesn't happen in slow motion. It explodes. Before the waiter on the right could reach beneath the silver dome of his tray, Leo moved. He kicked the heavy oak table upward with explosive force. The edge caught the edge of the silver trays, flipping them backward. Plates shattered. Glass sprayed like shrapnel. The deafening roar of a shotgun blast ripped through the restaurant. Screams erupted from the main floor. The jazz trio stopped abruptly, the bass dropping to the floor with a hollow crack. Clara moved purely on instinct and muscle memory from the basement range. She threw herself sideways, tumbling out of her chair as a barrage of bullets shredded the velvet upholstery where she had just been sitting. She hit the floor hard, scraping her knee, the emerald silk tearing against a shard of broken crystal. Clara, down! Leo roared over the gunfire. He was crouched behind the overturned table, his own weapon drawn. He fired twice in rapid succession. The waiter with the shotgun collapsed, his chest blooming a dark, wet red. The second waiter tossed his tray aside, pulling a compact submachine gun from his jacket. Clara knelt behind a heavy marble pillar adjacent to the alcove. Her ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the screaming patrons fleeing the restaurant. Adrenaline pumped battery acid through her veins. Her right hand found the grip of the Sig Sauer on her thigh. She pulled it free, condition 1, point and pull. She peeked around the marble pillar. Declan O'Connor was gone. He had slipped through a side door the moment the table flipped, leaving his men to do the butchering. The second waiter was advancing on Leo's position, laying down suppressing fire that chewed through the heavy oak table. Splinters rained down on Leo, forcing him to keep his head down. From the main floor, 2 more of O'Connor's men were rushing toward the alcove, engaging Dominic's undercover detail in a brutal point-blank firefight near the bar. Leo was pinned. He couldn't get a clean angle on the man with the submachine gun without exposing himself to the crossfire from the main floor. Clara realized she was flanking the shooter. She wasn't a mob boss. She wasn't a soldier. She was a woman who liked expensive tea and historical biographies. But the man pulling the trigger was trying to kill her husband. Clara stepped out from behind the pillar. She planted her feet on the blood-slicked hardwood. Shoulder-width apart. Lean forward. She brought the gun up, gripping it with both hands just like Leo had taught her. The emerald silk bunched at her waist. She kept both eyes open, the sights aligned perfectly over the center of the shooter's back. He never saw her. The noise of the submachine gun covered the sound of her movement. Clara pressed the trigger. The recoil snapped her hands upward. The gunshot was loud, sharp, and brutally definitive. The bullet struck the shooter just below his right shoulder blade. He jerked forward, a cry of shock tearing from his throat, the submachine gun spraying uselessly into the ceiling. He stumbled, dropping his weapon, and half-turned to look at who had shot him. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't let panic freeze her finger. She pressed the trigger a second time. The second round caught him in the chest. He went down hard, his body hitting the floorboards with a sickening thud. He didn't move again. Clara stood there, the gun still raised, smoke curling faintly from the barrel. She couldn't breathe. The smell of copper and burnt carbon was suffocating. She stared at the man on the floor. She had just taken a human life. It wasn't a paper silhouette. It was a man bleeding out onto expensive rugs. Clara! A heavy hand gripped her shoulder, yanking her out of her shock. It was Leo. There was a bloody graze on his left cheek, and his eyes were wild, feral with adrenaline. He looked at the dead man on the floor. Then he looked at the smoking gun in Clara's hands. He didn't look horrified. He looked entirely, terrifyingly awestruck. "Move!" he barked, grabbing her free hand. "Kitchen, now!" They sprinted past the shattered alcove. The firefight near the bar was dying down. Dominic's men had the upper hand, dropping the last of O'Connor's reinforcement. Leo slammed his shoulder into the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen was deserted. The chefs and waitstaff had long since fled through the alley access. Stainless steel counters gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. Pots of water boiled over on the abandoned stoves, hissing violently as water hit open flame. They ran down the line, slipping on spilled olive oil and scattered vegetables. Leo kicked open the reinforced steel exit door, leading them out into the damp, cold air of the back alley. Two black armored SUVs were waiting, engines idling heavily. Dominic stood by the rear passenger door of the lead vehicle, an assault rifle strapped across his chest. He looked at Leo, then at Clara, taking in the torn emerald dress, the gun in her hand, and the blood on her knee. "Declan!" Dominic shouted over the engine noise. "Gone!" Leo spat. He used his own men as a distraction to slip out. "Get in!" Dominic ordered, yanking the heavy armored door open. Leo shoved Clara inside and piled in right behind her. The door slammed shut with the heavy, vault-like thud of reinforced steel. Before they were even fully seated, the driver gunned the engine. The SUV tore out of the alley, tires screaming against the asphalt, leaving the carnage of the Cardinal Room behind them. The interior of the SUV was pitch black, illuminated only by the passing streetlights that flashed across their faces in rapid, rhythmic succession. Clara sat rigid against the leather seat. The adrenaline was crashing, and it was happening fast. It felt like freezing water rushing into her veins. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking so violently she couldn't maintain her grip on the gun. It slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floorboard. Leo moved immediately. He reached down, picked up the weapon, engaged the safety, and set it on the seat beside him. Then he turned to her. He didn't say a word. He reached out and grabbed her hands, trapping her freezing, trembling fingers between his large, warm palms. He squeezed firmly, grounding her, transferring his heat to her. Clara gasped, the reality of what she had done finally hitting the front of her brain. I killed him." "You stopped him from killing me," Leo corrected. His voice was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the violence they had just escaped. "He fell. He just folded." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, but the image was burned into her retinas. The blood, the sound of the body hitting the floor. "I didn't think. I just did what you told me to do." "Look at me," Leo commanded gently. Clara opened her eyes. The streetlight caught Leo's face. The cold, unreadable mask he wore for the world, the armor he used to keep everyone, even her, at a distance, was entirely gone. In the dim light of the armored car, he looked stripped bare. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world tilt on its axis. He reached up, his thumb wiping a smudge of soot and blood from her cheekbone. His touch was incredibly tender. "You saved my life, Clara. You saved mine first," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No." Leo shook his head slightly. He leaned in, closing the distance between them until they were sharing the same oxygen. "I tried to put you in a glass box because I thought you were fragile, because I thought you were something I had to protect from the dark. I was wrong." His eyes searched hers, dark and intense, burning with a new, raw reverence. "You aren't just my wife," Leo murmured, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "You're my partner. You're the blood and the steel." Clara stopped shaking. The shock was fading, replaced by a profound, undeniable clarity. She had fired a gun. She had taken a life to protect the man sitting next to her. She hadn't done it because of the marriage contract her father signed. She had done it because, somewhere in the twisted, terrifying labyrinth of their life together, Leo Rossi had become hers. He was a monster to the rest of the city. He was a ruthless, cold-blooded predator. But sitting here in the dark, his hands holding hers like they were the only things tethering him to the earth, Clara realized she didn't want a civilian. She didn't want a soft, easy life with a man who couldn't protect her. She wanted the monster. Clara pulled her hands free from his grip. She reached up, framing his face with her palms. Her thumbs brushed over his jawline, feeling the abrasive stubble and the tight, coiled muscles beneath his skin. She pulled him into a kiss. It wasn't a sweet, romantic embrace. It was desperate. It was violent. It tasted like adrenaline, copper, and survival. Leo groaned, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He kissed her like a man dying of thirst, pouring every ounce of the fear and pride he felt into the union. For the first time since she had walked into his house 3 years ago, Clara felt entirely awake. When the armored SUV finally passed through the reinforced iron gates of the Rossi estate, the world outside was quiet. The war with Declan O'Connor was just beginning, and the streets would run red before it was over. But Clara wasn't afraid. They walked through the front doors. The estate was eerily silent, swept completely clean of the staff per Leo's orders. It was just a fortress now. They walked up the grand staircase together. Leo's hand rested firmly on the small of her back, a permanent anchor. They reached the master suite. Leo pushed the heavy oak door open. Clara stepped inside. The room looked exactly as it had the night of the gala. The massive mirror, the plush rug, the remnants of a life that felt like it belonged to a different person. Leo followed her inside. He didn't turn on the lights. The moonlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. He turned back to the door. He reached for the lock. He didn't slide the deadbolt. He just looked at her, his hand resting on the metal handle. A silent question. He was giving her the choice. He was acknowledging that he could no longer lock her in. Clara walked across the room. She stood in front of him, the torn, blood-stained emerald silk hanging off her shoulders. She didn't look like a captive. She looked like a queen surveying her battlements. She reached past him. Her fingers closed over the heavy metallic mechanism of the deadbolt. With a definitive, echoing click, Clara locked the door from the inside. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and unwavering. "We don't do problems," Clara whispered, echoing his words from a lifetime ago. "We destroy them." Leo smiled. It was the smile of a king who had finally found his crown. There was a specific kind of silence that fell over a room when you finally decided you owned yourself. It didn't sound like a trap snapping shut. It sounded like a loaded gun, safety off, ready for war. Did the twisted, dangerous romance of Leo and Clara keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the transition from a gilded cage to absolute power, don't keep this thrilling ride to yourself. Like this video to let us know you want more dark, intense mafia romance stories. Share it with your friends who can't get enough of fierce heroines and morally gray men. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the drama, the betrayal, and the romance. Drop a comment below. Would you have pulled the trigger?